Thank you so much, Giselle, for a lovely introduction. The theme, obviously, of DLD this year is things being wild. I think it's fair to say, just from the conversations I've had with the three of you about this session, the supply chain ecosystem is a pretty wild place. So clearly the backbone of the global economy, clearly also an Achilles heel. And we've seen recently, obviously, how shocks can cascade and create really kind of, through these very complex networks, climate events, energy volatility, geopolitical shifts, and obviously also shifting regulation. So we're going to be tackling this. And maybe, Nadine, I can start with you if that's okay. I'm going to move my chair a little bit so I can see you guys. Need a bit of a reality check across the kind of like the global supplier network. Obviously, your work is in sustainability. Where do the goals that you have at BMW, where do they most often break down? Is it kind of data availability? Is it incentives, governance, capabilities? And how are you addressing that?
Yeah, thanks, Greg. So first of all, I would say the work in sustainability without going deep down the supply chain is not possible, because the biggest risk and the biggest lever also in terms of, like, for example, CO2 reduction lies deep down the supply chain. Yeah. Is it an easy job? No, it isn't. For sure not. But I would like to give you a little bit of an example how we work also with our suppliers when it comes to, for example, reducing the CO2 footprint in our products. So we have to look where actually, for example, CO2 emissions occur. Yep. And that's mostly down the supply chain when it comes to extracting and processing raw materials. So we really have to have the focus points, go there, work with our tier one suppliers, but also pass on our requirements then in order to tackle those very energy intense tier stages. And of course, it's complex. But it's also important that you identify the hotspots, and those hotspots are steel, aluminium, high voltage battery, meaning like battery raw materials, and this is where we have to tackle the topic.
So Frank, you're working on digitization, something really that is quite new to the supply chain network. Obviously, raw materials are absolutely essential to everything we do. Like we literally cannot function as economies without them. I'm really interested to get from you, just kind of like to level set, where do you see the kind of like the kind of key structural weakness in the raw material supply chain, and how will digital sort of fix that?
Yeah, thanks, Greg. When we're talking about raw materials, we always need to consider where they're coming from. Yeah. So we have on the one side, of course, secondary raw materials, everything that is recycled, but we have to be also clear. I know Europe is having a great hope on sustainability and recycling, etc. For the amount of new technology that we're building, we cannot live without primary raw materials. And when we're talking about primary raw materials, we're talking about mining, proper mining. And mining is DLD at its best. It's dirty, it's loud, and it's dangerous. Yeah? Whoever has seen a mine where they just blow up the surface of the earth to dig up the stuff out of the ground, then you know what mining is. And this is actually where the supply chain starts for the majority of raw materials that we're talking about. And the structural problem of that world is it's an economy, it's an industry that is roughly 3,000 years old, and it hasn't changed much. We had the conversation yesterday, how are the majority of raw materials being traded? Well, they're actually being traded over the phone, via email, etc. So this impression that there are exchanges and this is where materials are traded and everybody knows where it's coming from, that's nonsense. It's coming from sources where you can't imagine that they even exist. Yeah? They come from the middle of the jungle somewhere in Africa, potentially. And getting this to a level of transparency where people understand what is the price of this material, what's the sustainability, and you can question whether mining in itself can be sustainable, but at least with the lowest impact as possible. That's where we need to start creating more transparency in this entire segment of raw materials trading, and that starts with that the trading doesn't happen anymore in the back door rooms somewhere between two dodgy people, but actually on central platforms. And number two, that you link the physical goods and that you can kind of tag them with a sustainability passport, with a CO2 footprint, so that you can follow from the dirt that you kind of dig out of the ground down to the car, to the battery, etc. Yeah? And we're not talking only about those fancy kind of raw materials that everybody knows. We're also talking about those little things that if you haven't paid attention to chemistry class in the periodic table, where you don't even know what this is used for. Yeah? No phone works without it, etc. But it's highly complex.
So, Agate, I want to bring you in now. Frank's obviously kind of painted a picture of kind of like quite a fragmented, kind of chaotic industry to some degree. Just looking at it through an investment lens in terms of, building out these sustainable, resilient supply chains, very curious to know from you which areas you think are most investable at the moment. Is it data infrastructure? Is it circular models, traceability? What areas are most investable, and why is that?
Yeah. I'd say one of the biggest learnings when you connect the words supply chains and sustainability over the years is that you can't really build a very big, fast-growing business in the startup world, in the software world that I come from, if sustainability is the only goal. We've seen waves of startups that have tried to address traceability. They've tried to address the ESG reporting challenges. And if you isolate sustainability as the only ROI of the product, it's not enough. It's not adopted fast enough. In the end of the day, for any startup that's trying to solve big headaches for big corporates like BMW, you very clearly, quickly have to paint what's the ROI. And we live in a world where saying that your ROI is sustainability, full stop, is not enough. You have to be able to link it with, yes, your ROI is we're going to help you cut cost, we're going to help you communicate better with your suppliers so that something doesn't fall between the cracks. And by the way, we're also going to help you with sustainability, traceability, and data collection. So I'd say the biggest learning is sustainability alone is not enough. And then to your question, where do I see the most investable areas right now? I'd say 3 stand out to me where I'm seeing a lot of innovation and a lot of startup activity. First one, that to me is a little bit short-termist, but I've seen a wave of startups pop up that are trying to help to address the tariff land, the customs land. I mean, it's complete Wild West right now. And I like these startups because the ROI is very clear. You big corporate have a massive headache. You have international supply chains. Tariffs are changing all over the world. Let me help you with this magic tool, fix this. I like it. The ROI is clear. Buyers love it. From an investor's perspective, to me, it feels a bit too short-termist to really build generational companies. It's too small of a problem. You, again, need to evolve it into something bigger. The second trend that I'm really seeing pop up, especially in the wave of AI, LLMs, is supply chain intelligence to really plug into, for again, big corporates like BMW, plug in your whole supply chain so that the head of procurement can predict way in advance what might be disrupting our supply chains. And third wave that I see is also on the back of AI is agentic systems on top of supply chains, because in the end of the day, the supply chains, big corporates, they'll have thousands and thousands of suppliers. It's so much work, so many data points to tidy up, and it's actually quite well placed for agents to, let's say, deploy your agent to do the data collection, do the emailing, updating the spreadsheets, updating your SAP or ERP systems, et cetera, et cetera.
So, Nadine, I'd love to come back. We've heard from Frank and Agate really painting a picture of quite a diffuse and complex and slightly kind of wild ecosystem out there. That can't be easy for a corporate to sort of navigate, particularly around sort of traceability. So, I'd love to get your thoughts on which, obviously you're aiming for transparency. Which areas of that kind of value chain is the hardest to kind of to make transparent, and what has kind of worked for you in terms of ensuring that you have traceability at scale, the kind of scale that BMW needs?
Yeah. So first of all, I would like to elaborate on what you just said, Agate, and also you, Frank, because I think it's two important topics. We need digitalization because we need the data and the transparency, but also standardization. What we've heard now about complex supply chains, about all the also risks and fields in the raw material area, we have to work all a little bit at the system, outside our corporations, and trying to fix those standards. And that also counts for digitalization. So I would like to point out what we are doing, and many people have heard of it. Catena X is one of the efforts where BMW also since, I think it was 2021, started to bring also other OEMs and also suppliers in the automotive industry together in order to build an ecosystem, a data ecosystem for the secure and also decentralized exchange of data in order to build those supply chains and all those traces digitally. And I think this ecosystem has to connect then also to what happens in the raw material industry. And there we can build also use cases that help us, because thinking as a supplier when, for example, all the OEMs have different specifications, what do they want, different data protocols, we have to build standards as well on the data side, how can we exchange data, but also on the level of what are the standards, what are the schemes we need, and what are the requirements in order to really get ahead of this whole wide chain topic. And this is something we are working really hard on, and also together with a lot of partners and suppliers, which normally wouldn't be in our context, right? So there's a lot to do, a lot of enablement to do, and it's really crucial to build a solution that is future-proof for the topic.
Yeah. Can I ask a question? It's interesting, from the eyes of startups that are trying to solve the big corporates, one interesting thing that I've observed, and I'd love your opinion, Nadine, on that, is that oftentimes, like our thesis, when you look at a startup, you think if the big customer, like BMW, or take another industry, if it's fashion, it's Zara, H&M, if they demand something from their supplier base, the supplier base will comply in terms of data and so on. And over and over again, when I have looked at the problem through the eyes of startups, I've seen that it's not true. And I've sometimes been so surprised that these big brand buyers do not have the 100% power to really, really get everything they want from their suppliers. And why is that?
I think your opinion that we do have also the power to drive those standards and also requirements. If we're talking about components, that's pretty much a lot of impact we can have, and there is also alignment is easy. I think when it comes to the area of raw materials, that's becoming more and more difficult, because in the field of, for example, battery raw materials, we are not a big player. We really take maybe 1% or whatever in the automotive industry. We are not the biggest player, and companies don't count. And this is why we need this collaboration and need to drive the standards also on a broader level and on the raw material level, because there is not a big purchasing power there.
Frank, you were shaking your head there when Agate was talking about suppliers complying. What's that like from your experience?
You're absolutely right. I think the majority of big brands and OEMs, they don't have the power to influence that. The global raw materials market is Wild West. It is not what we envisage here with your supply chains of components, a car seat or something like that. I mean, you deal with in territories as well that have nothing to do, where people don't adhere to the same standards and anti-competition rules or competition, anti-collusion rules that we have here. It's a completely different setup there. And the only way, I mean, you were asking what needs to happen in order to set those standards, and the same here. I think it all starts with the trade. If you do not centralize the trading of those raw materials, you cannot set standards. And this is where in the past, the majority of OEMs and big consumers of raw materials, they all did bilateral trades with the suppliers of those raw materials. So it was never going through a central venue.
Right.
If you don't have that central venue, you cannot set standards. You cannot enforce certain rules. And now we also need to think of a second layer of complexity there that, well, there's a big player who is almost, in many of those materials, 50% of the market. That's China. So how does a BMW in itself want to set out a standard if you have a China Inc. that is setting a standard for themselves, or no standard?
Yeah.
So we need to unite, actually, in the G7 in the Western world and actually drive the trading of those raw materials through central venues, central marketplaces. If we don't do that, we have no chance at all to tackle that system.
Agate, I want to come back to you, talk a little bit more about investment in this area. Obviously, there's a kind of like a real hurdle around scaling for a lot of startups. Like, from what you see, like, what typically are the big hurdles? Why would a startup in this area fail, maybe, rather than succeed?
That's a very good question. I mean, the first one is what I already alluded to. Many times I've looked at startups where the hypothesis is that if you're a big buyer, you're going to be able to influence your supplier base. More often than not, I have seen how actually difficult it is to do in practice. Second, to your point about creating venues where we all trade, and I've looked at supply chains and marketplaces in most industries, and that's raw materials, timber, plastic, fashion. And every time I look at it as an investor, I was like, oh, that's exciting, that's a huge market, there's so many inefficiencies. And if we just had a perfectly functioning marketplace, this is great. And then you start to dig into when you talk to people in the industry and you realize like how it's still run in such an analog, old-fashioned way where so much is like built on trust and years of relationship. So for a big new startup disruptor coming in and ripping apart an industry that's a legacy type of industry, it's really, really difficult to do. And I have to say, like, it's painful to watch. It's painful to watch because the founders that pitch to me, they paint the problem so clearly and the solution is so obvious, but it's so incredibly hard to change behaviors of long, old-fashioned industries. And it's really the behavioral change that's the number one constraint why we don't have more transparent marketplaces.
Tell me about it.
We haven't talked about circularity, and Nadine, maybe I can bring you back in now. Clearly, BMW, huge consumer of steel, aluminium, plastic, batteries, textiles, all these things. Like, what do you see as the biggest sort of like near-term opportunity in automotive supply? Where can you really have an impact?
I think with circular economy, that's also a field where we really can change something and move forward, because a lot has to happen there in order to really coming to a circular economy. And I think like what we do today and what we are also proud of is that we have, for example, for the Neue Klasse, our new launched vehicle, the BMW iX3, already 33% in average recycled material in our car. And when we look into the high voltage batteries, it's for lithium, cobalt and nickel, 50% secondary raw material, so that is a good step, and we have a lot of CO2 reduction by deploying those measures as well. Yeah. But in the end, talking about a real circular economy, that's far bigger. Yeah. There's a lot of upcoming legislation as well, and there has to be a know-how building. The whole IT data infrastructure, again, has to be built up because you have to track where's the raw material, the secondary raw material coming from. And that all has to be set up, and we are, of course, as many other companies at the moment, really starting with small projects or also contracts, looking into a high voltage battery recycling, and it's a lot of piloting. But we have to move forward there, and I think there is a big chance really to also then go forward with the right standards and the right requirements for transparency in the field of circular economy.
Yeah, and clearly, Frank, sort of like what Nadine has just described here is a real necessity for corporates to have that kind of sense of provenance and traceability. From your perspective, how did you add that transparency without slowing down trading, without slowing down operations? And is there kind of like a way that we can get towards sort of some idea of like almost like frictionless compliance?
Yeah. I think that's an excellent question, because it kind of, what do you need to do to make sure that they don't lose the efficiency while they are still growing and making sure that they have all the information? So that only works with digitalization.
Yeah.
There's no way you can do that without it. The systems, the individual systems are there. I'm sure there are a lot of, as you said, sustainability startups that talk about traceability and that track certain things. We've got the technology also when it comes to recycling. How do you bring all of that together? And that is where the connectivity of platforms, traceability, trading platforms, plays a huge role. Because that's when you could, I'll make it more concrete. Let's say you recycle a battery or thousands of batteries. You've got something coming out of that, which is called black mass. Has nothing to do with some religious stuff. And this material is high in lithium, nickel, cobalt, etc. If you had a battery passport for every battery that was recycled, you would know exactly what is the content of each material. You could more effectively recycle that. Then you put this material on a marketplace. You can trade it with the right price, etc., and with the right CO2 footprint, sustainability footprint, etc. So the procuring company, let's say BMW, would know exactly what they are actually buying. They could immediately feed that into their product passport. Again, they would have an idea of what is the CO2 footprint, was it sustainably produced, etc.
Sure.
Yeah? It requires a certain amount of flexibility. I think also from a quality perspective, you need to become more flexible what you take. But I think the systems are there. We just need to connect now the dots.
Okay, Agate, you want to jump in?
One small anecdote to add. We were talking about that at the dinner last night, that, you know, to illustrate the state of the supply chains, is that if you order a Chinese takeout over Deliveroo or DoorDash, you know, for 20 euros, you know by minute exactly where it is, when it's going to arrive at my door, and you have perfect visibility. But in supply chains, big industry supply chains, you can have orders in millions, tens of millions, or hundreds of millions, and you're just flying blind. Sometimes you don't know when exactly it's going to arrive, you don't know what's in stock, and so on, and it just creates ginormous amount of inefficiencies. And it's the key is transparency. But if it's really, when it comes to supply chains, you can't address the problem step by step. You know, sustainability can't be in isolation, pricing can't be in isolation, logistics and traceability can't be in isolation. Really, the only way to really get it going is actually very complex, and it's very holistic, so that everyone relies on real-time truth in one platform, in one kind of
we need to have a transparent price. Sustainability has a price. There is no way around it. If you cannot put a price tag on a low CO2 product, you will also have trouble actually enforcing certain CO2 rules. If a more sustainable supplier doesn't get a premium for their products, it's going to be very tricky to actually encourage people to do more there. So the topic of pricing, transparent pricing in raw materials or in supply chains in general, is a huge topic. And there are, of course, a lot of forces that don't like transparent pricing. Traders, yeah? Certain people that like to get some money through different channels, yeah. But this is where industry can enforce it, and they can actually work with platforms, startups, with us, in order to create more transparency on the price as well.
Agate, I want to come back to you. What can large corporates like BMW do in order to speed up this process that Frank just described? Like, what do startups need in order to succeed from large corporates?
It's complex, but you need patience. You definitely need the mandate. You need the pilots. You also need, corporates really need to allow integrations. Back to that, if any one of the solutions acts in isolation, it's just not going to work. So you also really need to open up the integrations across all the systems. But ultimately, patience and vision that what could be achieved if we really crack it.
Well, I have
May I
to
just add something?
Please.
Because, I think it's very good statement here with regards to the vision and also the piloting, because of course sustainability in new fields you explore needs a lot of piloting, but as of a certain point you need to scale it, and especially when you're a big company and you have to focus on, of course, hotspots, but then scaling is essential. And I think if we make or talking about those ecosystems, and they are crucial because nothing works if you do it on your own, there is then again a field where also startups find their place for certain solutions or also elaborating standards, because that is so important to really work on common standards for doing stuff, for business solutions in the end. And this is why it's sometimes a bit complicated, but I think there is a place, and there's a great place also for the collaboration within those ecosystems.
But I think that the three of you have really delivered on the kind of the premise or the theme of DLD this year in terms of it's going to be wild. What you described is really complex, and it's so interesting hearing you talk about it. So we wish you, all three of you, the best of luck in taming the wilderness in the coming years. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.